We are doing actually a kind of old style stream. I feel like a lot of us are kind of recovering from the consequences of the pandemic. A lot of people I know are coming out of that. So that's been a huge journey for me. And I'm having to get used to being on my own. For those who don't know, I went through a big breakup a month ago. And so, like, it's been a whole thing. Just learning to be independent, getting out on myself. I even entered the dating scene a little bit. And I've just been kind of fixing up my apartment. My fiance had a giga mental breakdown and left me after abusing me. So yeah, Eris, I'm so with you on that. Holy shit. Partner abuse is a whole thing. There is an amazing book I encourage you to read. It's called Why Does He Do That? Even though it's about it applies. That's just because most abusers to like statistically are male, but it can apply to anyone. So they get into that. But you should read it. It's called Why Does He Do That? Really excellent book. It's helped me a lot. So, I heard Einstein had average grades. He might have, but he definitely didn't fail. And he definitely didn't fail math. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he finished calc in like middle school. Yeah, he was kind of brilliant. Our math teacher told us. I think that misconception gets told to like, so people don't feel bad about the fact that they're shitty at math, you know. But like, it's just a lie. And that's something else. So there's this book that I want to read, and I kind of want to do a second part of this stream, where it's literally about it's called How History Gets Things Wrong. And I find fascinating. For those who don't know, the topic of the meta, like talking about how history is written and how history is told, that's called historiography. It's like geography, but history. It's like the geography of history. And if you don't know how that, so it's historiography. We can put it, I'm sure someone could put in spelling in chat. And so this book that I want to read, it's, and you really see how history gets wrong in things that are political. So history gets used, like, look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now. If you go to a Palestinian protest, they're constantly bringing up history, right? And so their history, and a lot of times they're lying about history. And you'll see this again on the Israeli side, where they'll lie about history. And I'm sure those people who are lying, they're not intentionally lying. Like, I mean, I'm going to assume they're not bad actors. But the thing is, what you believe about history says a lot about you. You know, it's because it's the stories we tell ourselves, the stories of our origins. Look at the history that Romans, for those who don't know, Romans tell the story of Romulus and Remus, these two brothers, milked back to health. I don't know, what's the term? Groomed back to health or something? I don't know, that sounds creepy. Well, it is creepy because it's a wolf, but like a she-wolf basically, like heals them back and everything, and then they kind of, Rome gets founded, associated with rapes. There's like a whole story. It's all bullshit, right? Like, yeah, suckled. That's the term. Mr. Maddie, thank you so much for subscribing with Prime. Thank you. Everyone, welcome, Mr. Maddie, to the Aristocracy. Appreciate it. You know, appreciate it. The biggest lie right now in regards to history and the most toxic is that Israel's committing genocide. Yeah, and of course, the thing is that there also lies when groups, when people are not committing genocide, when people are committing genocides and they're saying that they're not. So, which is why people are skeptical of Israel in a situation like this, which I understand. And so, oh, Mr. Moni, did you read this book, How History Gets Things Wrong? It's actually by a guy named Alex Rosenberg, and it's about the neuroscience of our addiction to stories. So, going back to Rome, Rome is not founded by Romulus and Remus. Like, this is a total bullshit story. I hate to break it to all the Romans in chat. It's total bullshit, but it's a foundation myth. And these foundation myths are really important on how Romans viewed themselves, because they viewed themselves as particularly unique, particularly special. And when groups see themselves that way, not all groups see themselves as that, right? But how they're special is very different. Oh, thank you so much for Bauer. Thank you so much for subscribing with Prime. Oh my God, we're getting pretty close to my Prime goal. I'm sorry, my Prime goal, my sub goal. That's awesome. Okay. So something that I just find absolutely fascinating is, would Rome exist without that foundation myth? Right? Or is it necessary? Can you build a society without these foundation myths? Because look at the United States. There is a foundation myth associated with America. Now, as you get more modern, because it's harder to just completely make up bullshit, a lot of foundation myths have some truth to them. So, yes, America rebelled against Great Britain. They also wanted to establish a democracy. They also believed in the concept of free men and all these things. But what they considered free at the time is very different than what we consider free, right? Because, of course, only men who had property, only white men, definitely no women. Don't get, like, that would be ridiculous, right? And then on top of that, this is one of the most common myths associated with American independence, is that it was done over tea tax. You literally will see this on the History Channel. And I'm like, what? That's crazy. Like, that's total bullshit. I don't think any historian genuinely believes that now. Like, this isn't even my area, and I know this. Know what else is a huge myth about the Roman Empire? Byzantine. Oh, Byzantine, that's a good thing. That's, okay, remind me. That's a thing that we got to get into. But yeah, one of the reasons why the American colonies rebelled against Britain, they rebelled for multiple reasons, but one of the main reasons was because the crown had a bunch of deals with various native tribes in the region, and they had made a bunch of treaties. These treaties are very famous, and there's a lot of resentment because a lot of native groups still hold by those treaties because it's very important to them in their culture. And so a lot of the colonists they felt it was unfair to abide by these treaties made by the crown. They're like, you don't even live here. Why did you make peace with these natives? You don't even know what it's like dealing with them, right? You haven't seen their shit. And so it was like a battle of these rights. And we have this idea that somehow it was like them being progressive because they're going against monarchy, and monarchy is regressive, right? But in that situation, they were being progressive for the sake of being regressive to take more land from native people. And there are a multitude of other reasons why they rebelled. There's a lot of situations like that. A huge myth, one of the greatest ones, and this is one I believed for so long, is that the Roman Empire fell in 500 AD. Haven't you guys heard that one? That the Roman Empire fell, right? In reality, the Roman Empire doesn't fall. It's only the Western Roman Empire that falls. And then there's all these myths associated with it falling. And for some reason, we rename the Eastern Roman Empire to Byzantium, which is strange because they didn't actually even call themselves that. They call themselves Romans. Yeah, for some reason, the Eastern one gets renamed. I don't know why that happens. I'm sure there's some reason. If someone wants to find out, I'm sure there's some intense reason. Maybe it had to do with Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, but the Eastern Roman Empire does not fall, and it still has emperors, throughout its history, and they kind of follow similar issues that you saw in the Western Roman Empire. Sure, but also didn't the Russians also call themselves heirs of the... Oh, yeah, everyone did that. But I completely agree. I mean, the Germans did that, the French did that, everyone did that. That's not abnormal. But the Eastern Roman Empire literally was the Eastern Roman Empire. It was the same empire. It was like the exact same organization. It didn't fall and then it rebuilt itself and it was like, oh, we're going to make France great again. That's not what happened. So they only start calling it Byzantium in the 19th century. That's fascinating. I still think it counts as the Roman Empire falling since it's separating into parts, just like USSR. No. So it didn't, because it had already separated. So the Eastern Roman Empire and the Roman Empire actually split much earlier. I don't know the exact date, but they had already split. So it doesn't, if it splits in that, like on that day, like in 580, then that kind of makes sense. But I think that was actually a really good theory. But yeah, if they had split on that day, then that would make total sense, but it didn't. I think historians call it Byzantine because the colony that became Constantinople was initially called Byzantium, right? Yeah, there's this weird thing where like we call groups by random names, especially names that random historians invented in the 19th century. You can also tell like what a historian or what a society says, but by how they determine the cause and effect of certain problems. So the concept of the Dark Ages really starts in the 19th century because it's the Age of Enlightenment. So they're kind of demonizing Christianity a bit during this period, or at least like religiosity type of Christianity that was very popular during the so-called Dark Ages. So they call this the Dark Ages because of how Christian it is. In reality, it's the Dark Ages because it's really dark for historians to have to read through all these boring manuscripts from very boring monks. That's why it's dark, because it's just annoying. Istanbul was a successful ethnic cleansing. I hate to break it to you guys, but ethnic cleansing is like 90% of history. Literally, like that's just so common, so incredibly common. Istanbul is a settler colonial project. So it's hard. So the concepts of, it's hard with terms like that. In terms of practicality, like you're correct. Now, but and most historians would never let you say that. And I'll tell you why. Because they would consider the term settler colonialism as an anachronism. So that it's this wrong word. It's like you're using a word from a certain historical time period and applying it to a different time and place. And that makes no sense. It's kind of like the concept of racist. So people ask me all the time, were the Romans racist? And I always say no. No, they weren't. They weren't racist. I say that 100%. 100% the Romans were not racist. And everyone looks at me really weird. They're like, really? So they just were fucking colorblind, okay, in ancient Rome. So they were just okay with like beheading and all this, but they just happen to not be racist. And I'm like, yeah. Okay, they weren't colorblind, but they weren't racist. They saw color. And I'm sure the color affected some of their opinions of people. They had very strict ideas, but they were more likely to judge someone based on how they cut their hair. Or if they were Roman, if they spoke, well, if they spoke Latin well, or what their education was, who their family was from. They had different forms of hierarchies. Hierarchies exist in almost all societies. Race is a specific type of hierarchy, and it's not just a hierarchy based on ethnic groups, because Eastern Ethiopians have less in common ethnically, right, with someone in sub-Saharan Africa than someone than an Arab, for example. Like they're less in common. There's the most genetic diversity in the entire world is in Africa. Like literally they are more genetically diverse than like white people and Asians. Okay. So it's not about genetic differences. And you can see this visually if you look at different people in Africa, different black people in Africa. I think people have a very strict image of what a black person looks like because you have a very specific group of ethnic groups that come from Western Africa that get put on slave ships into the American slave trade. And so most people's image of what a black person is an American black person who's descended from those groups. So they have a very specific image of what a black person is supposed to look like. In reality, there's so much diversity in how someone looks if they're black, right? Like there's so much diversity. But anyways, there's the concept of race, right, is not a scientific concept. I mean, okay, technically it is because it was used in science for a little bit called race science, but it's not it's considered pseudoscience. But it's not that these colors don't exist. It's that we're making this arbitrary group. It's like all the people who have blonde or all the people who have dark brown hair with a shade of red, we're going to group them all together. And we're going to say that they are on a lower hierarchy than the people who have dark brown hair, okay, but with a cooler shade. And we've just created this arbitrary category, right? And yeah, you have some genetic tendencies, like people tend to have kids with warmer hair, if their hair was warm and all this stuff, but it doesn't always translate that way. So the Romans they would notice that someone was black, right? They would notice that someone had different features than them. And on average, humans tend to just be a little xenophobic, right? Like they're, people they like people who look a little more like them. But their priorities, the way they decided hierarchy worked, was far more based on class. So, and based on whether or not you were Roman. It was xenophobia. That's what they really were, and they divide people that way. So that's their focus of hierarchy. Now, race is a hierarchy that focuses purely on skin color, right? And it says, okay, we're going to take skin color, right? And the skull shapes associated with those skin colors. And then we're going to create a hierarchy based on this. And this really starts in the Enlightenment in the 18th century. So using the concept of race and even using the word race before, like using the word race before the 18th century is just a bad history. Bad history. Like, I don't want you ever to think of it that way. Don't think of someone as being racist. You can think of them being maybe a bit bigoted or a bit xenophobic. But racist is just not the right word to use, even colloquially, because that's just not how that person was thinking. They were not thinking, this person is lower than me because of the way their skin color is. Now, the Atlantic slave trade starts a little earlier than that, but the thing is that it starts because those groups were already being used, and often it was normalized to use them in the slave trade. And this doesn't connect with a lot of Christian morality, right? So they think, how does this make sense? How can we incentivize ourselves or make ourselves feel better? And so let's create this new hierarchy where we tell ourselves that the people that we are enslaving, okay, it's because they're just naturally lower and it makes sense to keep them as slaves. And you actually see the early seeds of this during, I think it's the 16th century, when the Pope makes a decree. He literally made an official decree. This is fascinating stuff. That natives were not allowed to be enslaved. This was after people found out how bad Columbus was. And they said natives were too noble to be enslaved, right? But Africans weren't. And so in the new race hierarchy that they were slowly building, they put Africans below natives in this hierarchy. Ironically, much more natives end up dying to smallpox and stuff regardless. So, the blonde brunette hierarchy. I just read what someone said. We'd enslave Italians and Africans? Yeah. They're mostly called Byzantine instead of, since they switched their legal and court languages mostly to Greek over Latin, right? Such as basilicals. Yeah, that's true, Jelly. Semi-good job, Pope? Yeah. So, Pope hasn't done all of this. There's this really important one. It's called, I think, the Tragedies of the Indies, because they used to call the New World, the so-called New World, is the Indies. You can look it up. It's by some kind of friar. I forget his name. Let me look it up. I'm gonna find out right now. Oh, short account. This one. Very famous. This is super famous. So this is a short account of the destruction of the Indies. And it was by this very well-known friar called, I can't pronounce his name, Bartolome de las Casas. I think he was Spanish. And he publishes this manuscript. This is after the printing presses exist, so it gets spread like wildfire. And so he had actually been in Central in the Central Americas when Columbus landed. and he witnesses some of the most horrific atrocities, right? And a lot of these are, he works with an artist to literally draw these atrocities, and they literally look like some stuff out of the Holocaust. So when this is, you guys still have Columbus Day in America, so, and Columbus did this shit. So I'll just give you an example. And this is so bad that even a dude in the 16th century, where they torture nobles, okay, they don't actually torture, well, they torture people and all this shit, even they thought it was a little bad, man. So you can see some of the vile shit that they did at the time, where they cut off people's limbs, they'd hang them all in groups, mass, if people didn't, they were mass graves. Like, this is insanely vicious stuff. Like, this is not just, or like, you know, here they show someone cutting off someone's limb, because if they didn't mine enough gold, they would do that. It's pretty nasty stuff. So he publishes this, and like this is probably one of the most famous drawings from it. And he publishes this, and it just spreads like wildfire. And the Pope finds out about it, and even Queen Isabella of Spain finds out about it, and they actually end up making a new law. I'm pretty sure, was Queen Isabella, was she even still alive by then? Yeah. Well, no, she wasn't. But I think they were done on her kind of orders or whatever. But it's huge, huge stuff. So even at this time, they're not using terms like racism and all of that kind of stuff. So that's why you don't want to apply it. But this is where you start to see the early signs, because that's when the Pope makes this law where it's like, whoa, Native people should not be enslaved. Like, that's particularly cruel. But it was okay for Black people to be. Does Eris read YouTube chat? Yes, I do. Quick question. What do you think was inside the Alexandria Library? Do you think the knowledge would have changed the course of history? Oh yeah, I'm sure it would have. I mean, even just one book could have changed it. I mean, one book has changed the course of history. Look at the Bible. Look at the Quran. I love that the easier it is to get information out to people, the better things for marginalized people. Information technology is so important. Yes, it is. For sure. For sure. Yeah, the printing press was huge for this. But anyways, so this is going back to what I was saying before. This is one of the things that, like, so the idea that people were racist in history is just not true, or that it's like this old idea. No, it's actually quite a modern idea. And that's why, and it's not something innate to humans. Humans are xenophobic by nature, but why on earth would you be more afraid of the group that had darker skin versus the group that has lighter skin when the group with darker skin has more similar values to you, right? Or is more likely to trade with you or something like that. It makes no sense. So it doesn't always line up this equally. That's like a very big thing. My books were in there. Hostess Rose, like, my books were in there. I get it now. Another thing is that people thought the world was flat. I think like a lot of people know this now, but there's this misconception that people thought the world was flat before Columbus, that Columbus invented the concept of it being round. Like, does anyone still believe this? On top of that, Columbus really just gets lucky in how he discovers North America. I think he like miscalculated the distance by like 6,000 miles or something. Columbus just thought the radius was smaller than it was. Yeah. The Greeks knew that it was round. Yeah, a lot of groups knew that it was round. I mean, a lot of Christians believed that it was round. Flat Earth chats. Yeah, from what I understand, most people thought it was kind of egg-shaped, including Columbus. I mean, who would think it was a perfect sphere? I feel like that is crazy. Absolutely crazy. But yeah, going back to Einstein, one of the other massive misconceptions. So Einstein was excellent, He's an excellent student at math. Like, seriously, he was top tier. But I think this is where people get misunderstandings. He later did have some trouble with it. After the publication of his special theory of relativity, he basically encountered some problems, just like any scientist would. And so to cut things short, basically, he addresses those issues that lead to the general theory of relativity. For this, he needed a lot of advanced math, which he was not familiar with. So it's not that he's bad at math. It's just like it was advanced math and that he recognized he needed that he just happened to not know. And he had a friend. I forget who his friend's name. Michael Grossman. Why do I think? No, it's Marcel Grossman. And Marcel Grossman knows a hell of a lot about advanced math and basically helps him. And they kind of all sort out together. I actually I read that the Byzantine Empire as a term only actually even gets used and starts in like the 16th century. There are also other weird, there's a lot of misconceptions. I'm trying to not focus on Israel and Palestine because that's the stuff that I know the most about. There's obviously, we all know there's tons and tons of misconceptions about that. Another big one that I was thinking of, a huge one, is that the Normans were French. You guys always heard that the Normans were French. Now, this one is a little tricky because it's technically true, but it's not true. So, for those who don't know, in 1066, the Normans, who are at the, they're ruling the northern part of France. That's why it's part of why I guess they're called Normans. So we'll get into that. And the William, the bastard, who is the Duke of Normandy, in France, he basically invades England and takes it away and wins the war in 1066. He wins, and becomes known as William the Conqueror. And so, and most English histories actually begin in 1066 because of that. And it's one of the reasons. And the Normans come and they bring Norman architecture and Norman language and all these things. And that mixes with Anglo-Saxon, which create Old English, which creates modern English. This is why English is a little bit French. But the Normans weren't really French. And they weren't actually French because the Normans were Vikings. They were called Normans because they were Northmen. They were literally descended from Rollo, who was a very well-known Viking. And he was regularly invading France all the time, raiding France all the time. He was constantly raiding France. And the French king was finally, I think it was a Charles. He's finally, dude, I'll give you a wife, maybe a daughter or something like that. And I'll give you some land if you convert to Christianity and stop fucking with us all the time. And he was like, okay, I just want some land, bro. That's all I wanted. So he converts, very famously, and his descendants are the Normans. And that's Norman means Northman. So they're actually Vikings. It's one of those weird ironies that the Vikings are the ones, and they brought castles and all these things because they mix with some French culture and they also become Christian. That shit is wild. I love things that turn out that way because you never expect it. It's just super surprising. Everyone believes this. It's medieval life expectancy. So I want to see who knows this. So the medieval, this is what everyone says. The medieval life expectancy was 35, right? I was always taught that in school. The average medieval life expectancy. And they're technically correct, but it's also a lie. This is one of the reasons why historians are so skeptical, because you learn so quickly how a fact can be misappropriated and to tell a lie. Um, but in reality, yes, exactly. Report the virus. You know your shit. Okay. Um, in reality, people actually didn't have a bad life expectancy. Um, People would live into their 60s, sometimes into their 70s. There were lots of recordings of people living past that, depending on the area. But even in Europe, even though they had bad healthcare and all that, but it wasn't as bad as people think. People in general have a tendency to assume that medieval people are way dumber than they were. Like, even the humor system of the body wasn't that bad. So, um, like infant mortality was massive. So if you survived that first year, you're basically kind of good to go. But it's one of the reasons why people had lots of children, because most of the children would just die. Most women would die in childbirth. I mean, because every single time, like I think like almost half of women died in childbirth. It was very dangerous. Childbirth was extremely dangerous, particularly infection, because they did not understand infection. They didn't understand being clean for childbirth and how important. So often a woman would get infected and she would die due to that. Very common. And then the baby would often die because of infections. They just did not. And in general, there is like a lot in science where it's like I think of all mammals, we give birth way earlier than most mammals. Like most mammals actually give birth when the baby can walk a little bit, like almost like a year in. But most of the baby growing happens outside the womb. So we give birth quite early. And that means that, and the reason why that works for us is because we're so smart that we can handle it. Whereas like, I think like if like, I don't know, a cow like just like gave birth to like a calf that was like the same age as a baby, they would be like, I don't fucking know what to do with you now. But even with our vast intelligence, it was still a massive challenge. So yeah, babies died all the fucking time. I don't know. I saw the documentary Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and they seemed pretty dumb. That's true. If you saw Monty Python, they seemed pretty dumb. Another great example is that that they were super dumb when it came to healthcare, in the medieval period. The idea that they just completely abandoned a lot of like ancient healthcare is not true. They absorbed a lot of it. Most doctors still worshipped Herodotus. Herodotus. I don't know why I said that. Uh, um, oh man, what's his name? The ancient Greek doctor. Like the Hippocrates. Thank you. I appreciate it. That's who I was thinking of. I thank you, Simonian. I appreciate it. Okay, everyone gives Simonian some kudos. Appreciate it. But yeah, so they didn't have germ theory, right? And because they didn't have germ theory, I think what gets invented in the late 19th century. And but they still had things that reflected similar things. And in fact, germ theory actually assumed that a lot of things that people in the medieval period thought were bullshit, and later we found out, as we found out more about science, were actually true. So a lot of the reason why we think medieval people were so dumb is because of the Victorians. So the Victorians kind of give us this false conception, because the Victorians are like, ooh, we're so modern. So, for example, in the medieval in like the medieval medical mind, there was this concept of bad air, like bad air. This is actually where it comes with the idea of you going at night, you're going to catch cold, because they thought night air was particularly bad. But the big thing with bad air is that when someone's sick, they have bad air around them. They're infecting the air. The Victorians thought this was laughable. Like, this is hilarious, because they believed in germ theory, and germ theory was about germs being on the ground and touching, and so it involved like you literally had to touch. So germ theory was great for handling things like clean water and all of that kind of stuff. But they thought the medieval people were psycho about the bad air thing. Of course, now we know after COVID, I mean, we've known this for a while, that there is such thing as bad air. And a lot of times, depending on the sickness, but a lot of different types of sickness there are airborne illnesses, and a lot of things are spread through, a lot of germs are spread through air droplets. So germ theory didn't actually counter air theory. And so that they were right, that there was bad air. And on top of that, they were right. We know that there's bad air when it comes to pollution. We know that there's toxins in the air. We know that asbestos can be in the air. Asbestos is a natural developing substance. So that stuff is pretty fascinating. There was this whole thing about a professor who was so mad about a guy who was trying to prove germs exist that he slammed his door and said, "Let's see if your germs can get through the door." Yeah, that's bad air, exactly. Yeah, and of course they weren't completely right about bad air because, like, of course, nighttime air is not actually that dangerous. It's not that bad. Girls named Erin or Eris can be toxic too. Oh no, rabbit. Um, there's a lot of situations like that where like we just assume people are being really dumb. Um, and we assume that people in the medieval period were just being stupid, but they were actually way smarter than we give them credit for. That's super fascinating. Um, Another one. This one is kind of controversial, surprisingly. This is kind of a controversial topic, guys. Wait for it. But pedophilia. So it seems to be a very common misconception that pedophilia was common in the past. I feel like I hear that all the time. I hear that a lot when people are trying to defend Muhammad and like Aisha. And there are plenty of other better defenses than doing that. Don't use that defense. That's a bad one. But it's very common. They'll be like, "Oh, it was a different time. It was a different time," right? We have this idea, and it's like, you really think in the medieval period, people were just totally cool with pedophiles and screwing kids. Okay, and it's not true. They weren't. Okay, we know so intensely. The thing is that hebephilia, which is, being attracted or having sex with teenagers, right? Like post-pubescent minors, was much more common, for sure, for sure. But like literally prepubescent was almost every culture has banned it. I can't think of a culture where it's okay. There are a few very rare exceptions, like if it was like considered like a religious experience or something like that. But it was never normalized. It was never normal to marry someone 9-year-old, and even very young teenage girls. There was a huge stigma against marrying them. So much so that I think in the 13th century, the Pope makes a decree, right? He makes a decree that literally a girl has to be cannot be 13 and younger when she gets married, right? She can get engaged before that, but she can't actually be bed until that. And so, because a few instances had happened of girls, where they're getting married and they're bed, because one of the reasons it's very dangerous to give birth at this time. So people thought it was just there are a lot of things that are just natural to humans, where it's just not a good idea for people to have babies so young. Base Pope again. The Pope's not always bad. But yeah, and they had a very intense idea about protecting children from these types of things. Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, is actually sexually assaulted by her stepfather in Sir Thomas. Oh God, it's something with an S. I forgot his name, but when she's a preteen, she's assaulted. I think it was like between 13 and 15. And it was a scandal. It was a scandal. I mean, it was a scandal because then people thought, oh, her innocence is being taken away. But it's also a scandal to him because people regarded it as an abuse of his power. So a lot of which is what we would regard it today. So like their morals are not as different as we think. Like, there are obviously some differences, but there's some basics. Yeah, Thomas Seymour. Thank you, Rabbit. I appreciate it. there's some basics, like they still had a concept of grooming, they still had a concept of sexual abuse, they still had a concept of pedophilia. They might not have used a lot of the exact terms, but they still did not, these things were not normalized or considered okay in society. And during the period when Muhammad marries Aisha, who is said to be 9 years old, right, when he beds her, it was not normal. It was not okay during the time. And there's a lot of evidence that he didn't actually do it, right? Because to be honest, it would kind of be a little bit of political suicide to do something that considered that gross at the time. And marrying a 9-year-old is different than bedding them. Like, because a lot of times people would marry or they would get engaged, they would get betrothed, but they wouldn't actually take them to bed until they were much later, much older. So there's a lot of evidence to say that Muhammad didn't actually do it. And it was just a lie that was spread later on by Aisha's descendants, because they were hoping because that was the only way it worked, because they were hoping to create a marriage and all of that kind of stuff, so that they were considered the official descendants of Muhammad. The Hadiths say it clearly. This is not even denied in Sunni Islam. Well, there's a lot of evidence to say that. I mean, a lot of shit in the Hadith and in Islam is not true. Okay, I hate to break it to you. Not a lot of evidence for a lot of it. So, but Muhammad was a historical figure. He did plenty of other shitty things though. Don't worry. But he might have done this. We don't know. I think the fact that people normalize it and stuff is weird. From a thread on Ask Historians, there are some scholars who say she was probably older, and that there are recorders of the Hadith say she was younger to emphasize her virginity and thus her suitability to marry the Prophet. Yeah, and you can say what you want, that it says a lot about a fucked up aspects of a culture, that's where they put their values, but still. It was not normal to do that. It was not normal in Arab society to do that at the time. And it's more concerning to me today. It almost seems more normal now, where we're like all like so many people act like that's not, it's like, oh, it was a different time, it's not that big of a deal. I don't know like why people think that. So another thing, this is a big one, this is also controversial, this is a big one. Ooh, I might get in trouble for this one, but white people did not invent imperialism, and white people didn't even do the majority of imperialism in the world. Yep, I'm saying it. I feel like that's going to piss off white supremacists and make white supremacists happy at the same time. Yeah, I'm saying white people did not invent imperialism. They did not invent imperialism, and the concept of they invented their specific brand of it. But there are plenty of cultures and religions, including Islam, that have conquered and taken over cultures. I mean, even the Israelite kingdoms did that. So it's kind of just, it's very human. And there is this weird racism of low expectations when people just automatically assume, and this is so normal. We're like, oh, white people and white people imperialism, blah blah, and it's not even. And some people will say, oh, well, I'm just talking about recently. I'm like, that's not even the case that's not even necessarily the case in the past 500 years. Have they heard of the Ottomans? The Ottomans were imperialists. They were conquerors. They were not like, they would conquer and they would make people into different ranks of demis in their societies. There's also, there's so many examples. I mean, look at the Japanese. Like, ask any Asian. If you're in Asia and they're like, are white people the source of imperialism? And they'll be like, excuse me? No. The Japanese are. Yeah, look at the Assyrians. Like, you can go further back. When you go further back, it's even more common. Like, the Persians. The Nubians. And even if you go to North America and you go to indigenous people, the Iroquois were incredibly violent originally. The reason why the Iroquois, I know a lot about the Iroquois just because they're the tribe that dominated the region of Ontario. Mohawks are part of the Iroquois, I'm pretty sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the Iroquois were conquering and dominating and engaging in smaller but still very similar forms of imperialism, which is why they were the dominant power in this region. Whereas you look at some other regions in Canada or in the United States where there's a lot more smaller tribes, it's like, no, there are no smaller tribes here. They were literally all conquered by the Iroquois. Don't ask the Japanese what they did in Korea. Yeah. A lot of people know about Nanking League, but they don't know what happened in Europe. Europe was powerful and had a lot more ability to conquer than most places. Okay. Here's the thing. Not all Europeans are white, right? So, I agree with you about Europe, at least in the last 500 years, but not all Europeans are white. The Ottomans are not white. I mean, you could consider them white. I don't know. I mean, they're Turks. You'll have to tell Hassan Piker that, and you'll be very upset. But the Ottomans were incredibly powerful. I don't know what the white supremacists came for me. They're like, how dare you say that we're the only powerful ones? Because you have to understand that, like, there's a weird consequence to when you say something like, when you imply that only white people or only a certain type of European is evil or is a conqueror or is dominant, right? You're implying that they're the only ones that can get to that period, right? That they're the only ones who are intelligent enough to get there, who have the ability to do it. So there is an inherent racism associated with it. Now, granted, a lot of people they might be saying it intentionally to be racist, but they also might be they're just told the wrong person. Hassan Piker's coming for you. He's like, how dare you call me white? I think there's a lot of delay with the stream. Interesting. I might have to fix that. But anyways, there are so many examples. I mean, even within Africa, even if I look at South Africa, before the British took over South Africa, there were a bunch of I think the Bantus were particularly dominant. Like, a lot of tribes are much more dominant over others, and they engage, and a lot of these tribes engage in atrocities against one another. So it's like, it's very strange, when we act like only white people can do something, right? And it's very weird. One time, I remember I was once talking with someone in Discord, and someone I think, like, we were talking about Islam, and I said something like Muhammad was an amazing conqueror, which he was. He was good at what he did. And then the guy goes, excuse me? Islam is a religion of peace, right? Like, you just called he called him a conqueror? And I'm like, I'm not going to get into whether or not the religion is a religion of peace. I don't really care about that. About the religious theology aspect of it, right? It's very common for conquerors to say they're conquering in the name of peace anyways, right? Yeah, but the guy says, like, and the person wasn't Muslim or anything. They were just like this white person. They were like, Islam was, what do you mean? And then I said, that's how do you think Islam spread in the Middle East? They conquered tons of regions, and they created systems of oppression to dominate the region and to obliterate them of their resources and all these things, right? And they're like, what? Stop. Why are you being so Islamophobic? And I'm like, what? What are you talking about? No, he wasn't even that far of a left. He was just a liberal. He just thought I was being some typical, like, Islamophobe. And I was like, no. In fact, you're the Islamophobe. This is Islamophobe in inversion. Like, this guy was a warlord. And Islam spread purely initially through conquering. And in fact, there's a doctrine in Islam where they separate two types of worlds, of the world to be conquered and the world that's already been conquered. It's a core part of their history. And to be honest, as someone who studies military history, I think that's pretty cool. Okay? I think that's a little cool. So, nerdity, it's true, he actually did, in his mind. But it's just wild that, similar to how Genghis Khan was one of the biggest environmentalists that humanity had. Horror Star, thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you. Oh, by the way, guys. So if you noticed, I'm just taking a brief break because I got to talk about money because I'm a streamer. It's my job. But I am raising money to pay for rent. So pay your minions. So yeah, I've had a pretty hard 2 months financially. So I'm paying rent now completely by myself. I had to move out on myself. I had no choice in the matter. So yeah, I appreciate any help for rent this month. It means a lot. Thank you so much for subscribing with Prime. I appreciate it, Bulo. But yeah, the best way to support me financially is not actually through subs, even though I appreciate subs and all of that kind of stuff, but it's just tips. Like, tips are the biggest thing. If you just click on my link, actually, I hope it works right now because I had to fix some aspects of my PayPal. But if you just click on my links of tips, I don't know, someone can just put on, just the tip. And help me out, especially if you appreciate some of the content and you appreciate the stream. That would be awesome. It'd be awesome to get some help, make things a lot easier. Cause yeah, I'm a little broke right now, having a tough time. Okay, so let's get back to it. Dun 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 dun. Dun. There's so many other examples of groups being like imperialists. I mean, the Japanese particularly were, but even the Chinese. Like, the Chinese get really mad about the Japanese doing it, but like, how do you think China took over China? Right? And if you look at the language, a lot of people don't know, China means the kingdom. Not means a kingdom, okay? It means the kingdom. Okay? So, interesting time to get interrupted by ads. Did I actually get interrupted by ads when I was making that little speech? That's so inconvenient. Did you guys all miss my speech? I don't even make that much money from ads. That's the annoying thing. But yeah, what I was saying, if you got interrupted by ads, was, I am paying for rent for the first time myself. And yeah, any help associated with it, because right now, basically most of my money goes to rent and very little goes to food, which is great for losing weight. But yeah, if you are kind of, oh, thank you, Harley, thank you so much, Harstar, for tipping $5. I appreciate it. It would just be very, very helpful. And the more I get, the more I can stream, because then I could dedicate more time to it. They politely asked to expand until they officially became China. Yes. Very much. That's exactly what China. People don't realize how big and culturally diverse China is. There's no way that many different people would come together voluntarily. Yep, exactly. There's a term for the ethnic group that dominates China. What's the term, guys? If I hear it, I'll totally remember. Like Han Chinese. There. Han Chinese are not the only ethnic groups, and they're not. And the thing is that white people in Europe and North America, they tend to think all Asian people look the same. Asians all know that's not true. So a Han Chinese can definitely tell the difference between like a Han and a Uyghur and like all that. So there are lots of other different groups. There are also lots of different tribes. Russia also has a lot of different ethnic groups. Some look Asian. Yes, for sure. Central Asian, for sure. I've become a connoisseur. Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think, if I hit $250 today, I'll tell you guys a huge story that will entertain you about some wild shit that happened to me. You just donated 20? Oh, why isn't it coming up as a notification? Sisitev, thank you so much for tipping $20. I appreciate it. It's 1% of my rent. Yes, it is. Thank you. You're good at math. You're not like Einstein. I appreciate it. Okay, I need to figure out why it's not showing my tips. Let me figure this out. Tipping. Okay, so tipping is working. It's just the notifications that are not working. Alert box. Twitch. If you don't know how to donate from YouTube, just click on my Twitch link on the dono button. And it should work. Follows. Subscriptions, rate, charity donations. Oh, tips. Okay. Test Twitch. Yeah, it should come up. Why isn't it doing that? Oh, you saw it? Am I crazy? I just didn't see it? It wouldn't be just the tip. Okay. Then I'm just going crazy. If everyone watched this gave $2.75, we'd hit our goal in a few hours. That's a good line. That's good. Okay. Anyways. There's it's weird because I find that people think that they're not being racist when they engage in this trope. But it's actually very typical of European racism to engage in that trope. Though I see it happen. I mean, a lot of other ethnic groups will take advantage of it. You see a lot of Islamic groups right now claiming that Europeans or Jews are the only colonizers or anything like that. And I'm like, okay. This is a test donation. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate the $9. Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, you've got a big Wikipedia fundraiser on screen. You're right. I do. Okay. Another big one is, okay. This one, I don't know if you guys would consider this one a lot, but that the indigenous people of the Americas were nomads. I feel like I heard that all the time. Sorry to interrupt. Okay, stop. It's really, I'm trying to raise money for myself. The idea that like the indigenous people of the Americas, or natives, or whatever you want to call, Rabid Wombat, thank you so much for the $10. You matter. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for the $10, man. I really appreciate it. Every dollar counts, so thank you. There's so much anti-Asian sentiment going around. They were indigenous nomads. They're also indigenous settled people. Yes, exactly. They were both, right? And there was also white nomads. There's like a lot of different groups. So a lot of indigenous peoples were nomads, probably a higher percentage. But there was also the largest indigenous groups in the Americas were actually settled. And they were agriculturalists. We're talking about the Inca. We're talking about the Maya. We're talking about the Aztecs, because our image, I mean, for us in Canada and America, we tend to think of indigenous people, the people that are around us, right? The largest populations of indigenous people were actually in Central America, Central and South America. Probably a lot nicer to live there. There was a typo. I meant you're composed of matter. That's good, Rabbit on that. Okay. Yeah, if I hit my $250 goal, I will tell the story. I will tell the epic story. So anyways, there were so many huge groups that were super, particularly the Inca. Like, damn. The Inca are my favorite. I fucking love the Inca. They looked really cool. Like, they had like really cool, like, they did these ear stretchy things. I don't know. I just think they looked amazing. I love the Inca. If you think the Aztec are cool, the Aztec will look really kind of lame after. Okay. Actually, I don't know if I'm allowed to show a technical dead body on screen. But because it's like a mummy. Am I allowed to show mummies on screen? Yeah, the Aztecs were assholes. That's so funny. So, the Aztecs get like destroyed by I think, what was it, the Spanish? And and they're particularly horrible to the Aztecs. But guess who helped them? The other indigenous groups helped the Spanish literally destroy the Aztecs because they're like, these guys have been ruining our lives. These are guys of the imperialists of the region.